Hey everybody! I really hope I'm in focus. I can't really tell from here. Welcome to my first little sewing tutorial. Let me take my AirPods out. So I'm gonna go over the very basics of how to sew. So if you are looking to learn how to use a sewing machine, how to sew, that's what we're gonna go over today. One thing I will not be going over today, or maybe even ever, is patterns. I really just wanna focus on making clothes for yourself that fit you, based off of like exactly what you want. So rather than going to a store and picking out a pattern, coming up with an idea in your head or seeing something like on a website online and being like, oh, I wanna make that, and figuring out how to do it yourself. That's kind of how I like to sew. I've never bought a pattern before, so I'm gonna show you how I do it. But first, today, we're gonna go over how to use a sewing machine. So this sewing machine is a Janome? I don't know how to say it, but Janome. It's a really common brand of sewing machine. I don't know the exact, or I do know the exact model. It's a 2030 QDC. It's my granny's. I'm not entirely sure where it's from or how much it costs, but within each brand of sewing machines, there's definitely a range of like price. So you can find a cheaper one. Basically, on the sewing machine, you have two places where thread comes out. So when you sew a stitch, there's thread along the top and thread along the bottom. So up here is the top thread, and that comes down through the front into the needle, which is right here. And then on the bottom, there's another compartment where you have the bobbin and the bobbin thread, and that is the thread along the bottom of the fabric. So I'll show you how to thread the bobbin. So basically, you're gonna pop your top thread up here, pop the top thread up, and then you're gonna loop it around this little screw looking thing here, or whatever it is on your machine, and you're gonna put the thread through the hole in the bobbin, and you're gonna pop it onto the little thing and lock it into place, and you're gonna press the sewing machine pedal and you're gonna run it until the bobbin is full. So that is gonna go down into the bottom. So for me, I'm gonna take off the cover here. Covers up the bobbin compartment. And I'm gonna take my bobbin with the thread and I'm gonna place it in there. I'm gonna loop the thread around where it's supposed to catch. This is probably different on other machines, but if you have a manual with yours, you'll be able to figure it out. You put it through there, put the bobbin case lid back on, and then you're gonna thread your top thread. So keep it where it is up here, but you're not gonna have it looped to where the bobbin thing was. You're gonna loop it around in the direction of the arrows. There should be arrows on all of the machines. My machine has this handy little needle threading device on it that helps, but you just make sure that your thread has been cut with sharp scissors, so you should be able to get it through the needle. Okay, this is really hard to explain, but you've got to get your bobbin thread to be coming up through the hole underneath the top needle. So basically, all you have to do is turn the dial on the right of your sewing machine so that your needle goes down into the bobbin section, as you'll see right here, and then that catches on the bobbin and it's gonna pull the bobbin thread up, and then just take something like a needle and pull it through like that. And that is how you thread your sewing machine. And then If you take a look at it, you will see some knobs, some buttons, maybe a digital screen on mine, but maybe not. It should automatically be set to just a straight stitch. So if I'm looking at all my different stitches, that's 0, 0. And then it's set to a width of 3.5 and a length of 2.2. So we're gonna keep that how it is. This is just basic stitching size. And then there's gonna be a tension dial. Mine has 3, 4, and 5 are kind of circled because they're just pretty typical. It's gonna depend on like what fabric you're using. If you're using a really stiff fabric, you can have the tension higher. If it's a thinner fabric, you can have the tension lower. I also lower the tension sometimes when I'm trying to get over like some sort of bump in my fabric that's hard to get over. But I just usually have mine set to 4, which is kind of right in the middle. And then there is the speed. I don't know if all sewing machines have a speed adjustment, but mine does. I usually have it on the fastest, but if you're starting out, this will be really helpful because you can keep it so that you don't end up sewing too fast. And then, yeah, we can go over stitch lengths and stuff later, but you generally don't need to change that until you're like gathering, and you can't really think of any other situations. So we'll get to that another time. But first things first, we have our sewing machine set up. Let's try and sew something. All right, so right now I'm in the middle of making a main top for one of my March orders. And I have a strap here that I need to sew along this way. So I will use this to demonstrate how this works. Folding this in half. I'm gonna pin it. I'm gonna be professional. Okay, I'm not really in frame, but that's okay. So I guess I should talk about seam allowance. Common seam allowances are 1/2 inch and 5/8 of an inch. I usually work with a 1/2 inch seam allowance on everything, and that's what I have here for the strap. So on the machine, next to the needle, there's going to be little markers with measurements, and fortunately they are in inches, which is what I use. So I'm going to find the line that says 1/2 inch, and I'm going to line this up with the 1/2 inch mark, and I will sew along that. Okay, to demonstrate what I mean, here is the 1/2 inch seam allowance marker. There's 5/8 and there's 1 inch. Alternatively, this strap, this width here is 1.5 inches. So that means it's gonna be 1 inch when I take off the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So what I often do is, instead of sewing along that 1/2 inch seam allowance, I find the inch marker and I go the other way. So that's what I'm gonna do. When I sewed this strap, I could have lined it up with 1/2 inch there, you know, but instead I lined it up with 1 inch right here. All right, now that we have sewn this strap, we're left with the seam allowance being the 1/2 inch from the edge to the needle. So my stitch, it's 1/2 inch. I don't know if I'm over explaining, sorry, but we now have 1/2 inch of extra fabric, and this is a strap, so what I have to do is turn it inside out. And that extra 1/2 inch is gonna make it too bulky. It's gonna be really hard to flip inside out, and it's gonna look weird. And this doesn't just apply to straps, this applies to everything in sewing, every single seam. So we have to cut it off. I'm gonna cut it down to 1/4 inch or a little bit less, but obviously make sure you don't cut it too close to the seam, or else you could accidentally cut the thread, or it could just pretty easily come undone. So we're gonna cut our seam allowance down. And this does produce scraps that are too small to use for anything else, unfortunately, but it's just kind of a part of sewing. There isn't really a way around these, but you could use, I use them for tying together orders. You could definitely use these to like stuff something like a pillow or like, I don't know. That is how you sew a seam. That's how you sew a seam with seam allowance, and that's how you cut off your seam allowance. Now I'm just gonna turn this strap inside out. My next thing is gonna be a scrunchie, so I guess I might as well show you this because it's pretty much the same formula. Sew a tube, turn it inside out. Taking a big safety pin here, and I'm just hooking it through one layer of the fabric, not, you know, both layers, and turning it into the tube and shuffling it along so it bunches up, and then helping the fabric turn inside out or right side out. But we just keep doing that all the way along until we've got it completely flipped. It's definitely easier with like a slipperier fabric, but cotton gauze is not slippery. All right, there we go. Now it's right side out. And it's not flat, so we have to iron it. Hey everybody, it's a new day, but I am back to finish this sewing video. So, in the last clip, you saw me make a strap for an order that I was working on, but we're gonna use pretty much the exact same steps to make a scrunchie. So, I'm gonna show you how to make a scrunchie. First thing you're gonna need is some elastic. This is 1/4 inch elastic. It's easy to find now. It was totally cleared out of everywhere pretty much all summer because everyone was buying it up to make face masks, but I got this at Michael's the other day, so it seems like places are back in stock. So this is a piece of 1/4 inch elastic, and it is a little bit too long. 10 inches long. Now you can do 9 or 10 inches. It all kind of depends on what kind of hair you have, but I'm doing a pretty big scrunchie, so I'm making this 10 inches. And for the scrunchie, you can use pretty much any fabric, I think, as long as it's light enough to turn inside out and like be comfy, I guess. I'm using cotton gauze scraps from my order. And this piece of fabric is 24 inches long and 6 inches wide. And why those exact measurements, you ask? Well, it's because I have this measuring thing, and I'm so lazy, and I use this for literally everything because I just lay it on the fabric and I cut around it with my rotary cutter. So I use this for like literally every square thing that I make. But the 6 inches wide means that my scrunchie is like a 3-inch scrunchie. A little bit less because of seam allowance, but it makes a really wide scrunchie. If you want more of a normal scrunchie, you can do like half that, like cut your fabric to be 4 inches, but don't do that, make a big scrunchie. So this piece is 24 inches long and 6 inches wide. And this measurement will make you a scrunchie that looks like this. So these two are patchwork scrunchies, as you can see, but they were made using 24 by 6. So that's the size of scrunchie you're gonna get with this measurement of fabric. So all you need is your sewing machine with thread, some pins, 24 by 6 fabric, and a 10-inch piece of 1/4 inch elastic. And the first thing we're going to do is to fold our piece of fabric in half long ways, like so, and we're gonna sew along the seam using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, like we just did. So I'm gonna pin that, and then we'll get right into it. Okay, so now we've got our piece pinned in half long ways. So this is now 3 inches wide, still 24 inches long. We're gonna sew up the seam using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I just lined up my fabric here with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and I realized I didn't say this in the last clip. This is kind of important. So you're gonna get your fabric in there, you're gonna put your pressure foot down, that's what this is. You're going to put your needle down, and you're gonna sew a couple of stitches forward. And then you're actually gonna sew a couple of inches back. And of course, not all sewing machines are the same, but they will all have a reverse function. For mine, it's this button right here that's like a little backwards arrow. So I'm gonna hold that down while I sew a couple inches back. A couple stitches, sorry, not inches. And then I'm going to sew forwards again. Make sure you don't sew over your pins. You can break your sewing needle doing that, so just take them out as you get near them. So we're just about at the end of the scrunchie, and we're gonna do that same thing we did at the beginning. We're gonna back stitch again. So we'll get to the end. And then we're gonna reverse stitch and forward. And then lift up the needle, lift up the pressure foot, and we're gonna pull this out and cut the thread. There we go. Okay, now it's the same sort of thing as before with cutting off the excess seam allowance. We're just gonna take our fabric scissors and trim it down. So I'm leaving about a little less than 1/4 inch of fabric to the right of the seam. I'm pretty much cutting right in between the edge of the fabric and the seam that I just sewed. And now we're gonna turn this inside out just like we did with the strap, or just like you saw me do with the strap. So we're gonna take our big safety pin and we're gonna here, I'll show you what we do. So if we open up this tube, we want to just catch one layer of it in the safety pin. So I grab the one, not the edge that I sewed, but the other edge. Just grab one layer there, and you're going to take the pin and just pierce it through like so. Close the pin, and then you're going to tuck it into the tube, and then you're just going to shuffle it along. And once it kind of stops, you will just gently pull it, and you'll see the fabric is going into itself. And then just continue to shuffle the pin along and pull the fabric along. Take the safety pin out, and we've got our tube that is now right side out. And we just have to iron it flat. So let's go over to the ironing board. As you can see, this isn't very flat, so we're just gonna find the seam that we made here, and we're just gonna try and flatten it. So just sort of grab the seam where you can see it, and you're gonna take your iron and just press that. Now you can of course press the whole piece of fabric. I'm not, just because this fabric loses its texture when it gets ironed, and I'm not going to be putting this in the dryer to re-fluff it, but you can totally just iron the entire piece. But I'm just trying to iron right on the seam itself. So now my seam is all nice and pressed. It looks a little wonky because I didn't iron the whole thing. I just ironed the side, but don't mind that. The next thing we're gonna do is we need to tuck in one of the raw edges of this. So this piece has 2 raw ends. We're just gonna take one, doesn't matter which one, and we're gonna tuck it in. So I'm just gonna tuck it in by, this is about 1 inch. And the reason we're doing this is because when we connect the scrunchie, it's gonna be like that, but with the elastic in it. We're gonna tuck this raw end into this sort of hidden end. I hope that makes sense. But it's easier to hide this end and iron it before we get to that point. So we're just trying to line it up as best we can, and we're gonna press that with the iron. Okay, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna thread the elastic into this tube. So we're going to take our big safety pin again and our elastic, and we're just gonna put this through one end of the elastic, like so, and then we're gonna put it through the scrunchie. So take one end of the scrunchie, take the safety pin, and we're gonna shuffle it along, kind of like how we did when we were turning the scrunchie inside out, except we're just shuffling the elastic through. The elastic is quite a lot shorter than the scrunchie, of course, so once we have just a little bit poking out like this, I like to just pin it so that I don't accidentally lose it. So I'm just taking another safety pin and I'm pinning the elastic to the fabric of the scrunchie. Now we can continue to feed the elastic through without worrying about losing it, because it's gonna bunch up like this and it's gonna start looking like a scrunchie. Okay, so now we have elastic coming out of both ends, and we're gonna make sure that our scrunchie doesn't get twisted. That would be twisted, this is not. So I'm gonna take these two ends, I'm gonna take this smaller safety pin out of that end, and I'm gonna take this safety pin off of the elastic, and I'm gonna put them together like that. They're gonna overlap by about an inch again. I often just tie them, so make sure you do a really secure double or triple knot. Make sure it's really tight, and then we can just trim off a little bit of the extra elastic. And now this clearly looks like a scrunchie. We're almost done. So I'm just moving the knot a little bit further into the scrunchie, because now we have to overlap the folded over edge with the raw end. So we basically just put it inside. I don't really know how else to explain it. Try and line up the seams together and just shove that raw edge inside the folded edge. I hope you can see this clearly, but we've tucked the raw edge into the folded over edge, and I've just added 2 pins to help that be secure. And the next thing that we need to do is sew a line along here to secure the scrunchie. Now make sure that where this line is, it's as close as possible to where it is on the other side, so that you don't accidentally miss the other side while you're sewing this side, if that makes sense. I'm gonna switch my stitch from a 0, so a straight stitch, to stitch number 1, and basically all that's gonna do is move my needle over like a millimeter, but it makes it easy to sew along an edge here. So I'm going to line up this edge with this little line on my pressure foot, and I'm gonna sew along here. Make sure you do a back stitch to secure it. So sew forwards a little bit, sew backwards, and then go forwards. I'm throwing a little smoke and sage tag in there, but basically we're just sewing along that edge. And when we get to the end, we want to make sure that we back stitch again. And a final forward stitch. the needle up, pressure foot, and chop our threads. Now just cut off your loose threads that will be hanging off up here and down here. And now we have a scrunchie.